Hi there, this is Pam from Around the Table Yarns and our very second meeting of our new Amigurumi Club. This month and next month, we're going to be doing Cory the Giant Bunny, the free pattern by, I think it's Airali, Airali Design. He's very cute. He's a free pattern available on Ravelry. He's been a lot of fun to make. So we're actually going to start with the pattern. There's a few reasons why I chose this. So let's go to the camera and share. And let's make this bigger. And then if other people pop in here, we can see. Okay. Couple reasons why, and we talked about this a little bit last time about finding a good pattern. It had several people who had made the pattern. It had a high rating on Ravelry, which is how I started. She had a very thorough list of materials. She did this in a bulky yarn, and they ended up being about 22 inches tall. I am not using a bulky yarn. I don't think anybody who came into the shop is using a bulky yarn. You can do this in any size yarn. As long as you use the same yarn for all the pieces, he'll come out proportional. It is a beginner pattern, which I liked. She does give good pattern notes that it's not necessary to use the recommended size hook and yarn. And she talks about that they're going to be using the Amigurumi method, which is, we talked about this last time, the continuous spirals working in the round. You're not finishing a round and closing with a slip stitch. You're just continuing around and around and around. Okay. He's worked in pieces and then sewn together, and she gives abbreviations. The only thing I will change on here is where she talks about the decrease. She uses a regular single crochet decrease. I'm going to do, which you can absolutely do, but I like the invisible decrease, which we talked about last time, and I'll show again tonight. And she also gives the number of stitches at the end of each round, which is very helpful, particularly if you're new. Okay. All right, so that's the first page done. And then she's got it divided up by pieces. There we go. So she's got it done up by pieces, and every piece begins with 6 single crochet in a magic ring. All the pieces start the same way, and then they increase to their particular shape and size. So I recommend starting with the head. And because all the pieces start the same, we don't have to go through every single piece to get going. So I found that was helpful. All right, a couple of things on the pattern here, on the head piece in particular, and I'm going to show you in just a second. She shows you round by round what to do. When it comes to rounds 11 through 18, and she tells you that's a total of 8 rounds, you're going to be single crocheting in each round without any increases or any decreases. Okay, I call that, when there's no increasing and no decreasing, I call that part the straightaway, where you're just maintaining your current number of stitches. So before we started that, you'll have 60 stitches. At the end of those 8 rounds, you're still going to have 60 stitches. Okay, I'm going to show you a little trick to make that maybe go a little faster, a little easier. And then I'm going to scooch down here. After row 21, she tells you to insert the safety eyes between rounds 16 and 17, approximately 16 stitches apart, okay? So I recommend making a little note on your pattern that when you get to this part, 11 through 18, maybe but when you end row 18, and I'll show you here in just a minute, to go ahead and put a stitch marker to mark where your safety eyes are going to go, and that will save you the trouble of having to count your rows later, okay? She tells you kind of after the fact, so I just put a little star by those rows and refer back down to here that you're going to mark for your safety eyes. If you're doing safety eyes, you can absolutely do embroidered eyes. But if you want them to look the way that and be proportioned the way that the sample was done, then that's where she put them, okay? And then she talks about stuffing the head and continue as you go, stuffing as you go. I didn't feel the need to do that. I actually didn't feel the need that I had to stuff any of the pieces as I was going. I felt like there was enough room, and I'm going to give you an example of that, okay? All right, to the pieces. Let me this a little okay. When you're working your rounds, this is the stitch marker I like to use to mark my beginning of each round. I still do this. I mark, particularly going in the round like this. And if you're using the invisible decrease, it's really hard to see where you've been. So I always put a stitch marker in the top of the first stitch of each round. All right, so I will demonstrate that as well in a second. So having a couple of these, because you'll lose one. Picking your yarn and your hook. So I used, I'm making it actually two different yarns. I'm doing it in the Sheep Just Stone Washed, which is a sport weight yarn. And with that yarn, I'm using a size C hook, 2.75 millimeters. I'm also using Chunky Monkey, which is an Aran weight or heavy worsted weight yarn. Let me zoom out just a little there. And with that one, I'm using a 3.5 millimeter hook. And here's how I chose that. I started, you know, we talked last time about when you're making the amigurumi, something that you're going to stuff. When you look at the yarn label and it gives a recommended hook size, you always want to go something smaller than that. And the recommended size, most people tell you, is 2 millimeters smaller so that you don't have stuffing coming out of your shape, that the holes aren't too big, okay? For this one, I felt like even after I started making the pieces in the stone wash, and the fabric felt very stiff, and I wondered if I should have gone up a hook size. But then I stuffed it. This is the head stuffed with that, and I feel like it's very squishy and soft, and I don't feel like it is too firm, and I don't have any stuffing coming out. I did the same thing on the Chunky Monkey, and I feel like the fabric is very firm, and I almost wish I had gone up maybe 0.5 millimeter size, so maybe to a 4 on this one. But again, that's dependent on your tension. So take the time to play around with this a little bit. If it feels way too tight or too firm, know that you can adjust that a little bit. Play with your hook size just a little. And I will say, the very beginning ring isn't always the best measure because it's a lot of stitches really crammed in there really tight. Do a few rounds and then really see if you like it, if it's got any give, if the holes are starting to show when you start to do increases, okay? But give yourself a chance, and don't necessarily follow that 2 millimeter rule. I do feel like this one, it worked out fine. This one, I wish I had gone up a hook size, but I was already committed. And I did stuff a piece, and I do feel like it is soft and squishy. It definitely changes the way the fabric feels once you add stuffing to it, okay? So know that that's coming. Feel free to jump in with questions at any time if I'm I have a list of things I wanted to make sure I covered, but if you have other questions and they're appropriate, jump right in.
Pam,
Yeah.
sorry, I am using the Chunky Monkey, so which size hook should I be using?
So do you think you're a tight or a loose crocheter in general?
I'm not much of a crocheter, so I would say I don't know. Yeah.
So I would say maybe start with a 4mm, which would be a G hook.
Okay.
Or you might even go to an H hook.
Okay.
And if you find that you are on the looser side, then err towards the smaller.
Okay.
I think you'll know once you start. If you feel like you're going to have holes that the stuffing's really going to come out of, then go down a size.
So do I rip it back or just keep going?
Just keep going. If you feel like it looks good, I think it's just fine. If you're happy with it, there's no absolute right or wrong way. If you use the recommended hook size and you're not an exceptionally tight crocheter, I do feel like the stuffing's going to fall out. So as long as you've adjusted a little bit and it looks like the holes are very tight, then you're probably going to be just fine.
Thank you.
Does that answer that?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, good. Okay, so let me show you how every round is going to start real quick. Let's pull out. I'm going to do it in the Chunky Monkey so it's a little bigger. All right, and I do have a video of how to do the magic ring. If you've not done it before or still need a little refresher, I have that on. There's a link to that video on last month's Amigurumi page. You can click on that. All right, so with your tail, drape the tail over your palm. I'm gonna leave myself a little bit of maybe a couple inches hanging off. Take your working yarn, wrap it over those fingers and crisscross. And then turn your palm over so that I have parallel lines on the back of my hand and crisscross, and I'm holding it in place with my thumb and my pinky there. Right? Then going underneath these two parallel lines, underneath the first, grab the second, go over the first again, grab the second and pull it through the loop on your hook. All right, and slide your fingers out. You've got this magic ring that when you pull the tail is adjustable. All right. Every piece starts with 6 single crochets into the center ring. And I'm just going to show that first beginning real quick. There's 1. And since I'm not in the round just yet, I'm not marking that first stitch I made. It's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then I believe every piece, I'm going to pull this to join it into a circle. All right, so here was the first one I made, and I'm going to make 2 single crochets into that stitch. And I'm going to do 2 singles in every stitch. So I'm going to increase in every stitch. So go in, make my first single crochet. And for some reason, always at the beginning, I end up splitting the yarn a little. So here I made the first single right below that loop on my hook, and I'm going to mark it with my stitch marker. That is my first stitch of the round. And then as I'm coming around, I'm not wondering when I'm supposed to stop. Let me get my split fixed. There we go. All right, so now I make a separate one in the same space. And continue around 2 in each single. I'm not going to do every round. I just kind of wanted to get started here. And then I want to show you some tips as you are working along. I've got some pieces in various stages of being done. Beth kept asking me if I'd finished my bunny. I'm like, no, I have all his pieces and parts in various stages of being done. All right. So that should be 12. I'm just going to do a quick count. And here is how I go back and I count. I always take out my hook because it gets in the way, and I pull my loop big. That way it won't come apart. Count below my loop. That's my last stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and my last stitch should be my mark stitch, which is 12. Okay. And then to start your second round, I take out my stitch marker, make my first stitch, which happens to be an increase. So 1, mark it. Okay. See, already dropped it. Thought I had a second. And with my increase. And then I would continue around. So on round, here's how I worked. Let me just here. So I used tick marks. I had a pencil handy all the time. And as I did a round, if you were not to do that, and you weren't sure which round you were on, because she gives you at the end of each round how many stitches you should have, you could count your stitches and see how many stitches you have and see what corresponds with that piece. So that is a great way to check. The only time where is when you have those straightaways I was talking about, where you're going to end up having the same, and then you might have to figure out how many rounds have I done that with. So you could do tick marks every time you go around, or I'm going to show you a little trick for that, counting your straightaway rows. All right, let's at your beginning round marker. All right, so here's another piece that's a little further along. This happens to be a leg that I'm making, okay? And my pattern tells me rounds 5 through 9, 5 rounds are single crochet. So there's a little straightaway there. So I did rounds 1 through 4, no problem. So here's rounds 1 through 4. Let's see. So what I did is I came around and I finished the first round of single crochet. I took an extra stitch marker, and instead of putting it, I'm going to demonstrate on the top of this one. Instead of putting it in the top of the stitch, like we normally do, I put it around the post of the stitch. Whoops. Like this. All right, and I marked it like that. And then I continued around with my rounds of single crochet. So because we're going in a spiral, your beginning of round is never going to line up straight up and down. If you are a right-handed crocheter, it's going to tilt to the right. If you are a left-handed crocheter, it's going to tilt to the left. It's always going to be at an angle. So this was my first round that I did right here. And now I can just count the bumps to see how many rounds I've done. I also used a stitch marker. This was the beginning of the next round, and I marked it so you can see how they don't line up straight. And you can see how that angle, it's always one stitch over. So here is the first round that I completed. Here's 2, 3, 4, 5. So I wouldn't necessarily have to have this stitch marker. I could have just kept going and then stopping. This hadn't been here. I could just look, how many rounds have I done? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right. So when you've got those straightaway rounds, you can absolutely do them the way that we've been doing them. Mark your first stitch, come around, mark your first stitch, come around. Or you can take that stitch marker off completely, mark your first round, and then count your rows. A couple of reasons why this is helpful. It was nice to not have to stop and take that stitch marker off every time, particularly on the smaller pieces, because there's not that many stitches around. On the head, it was, a lot more stitches going around, and I put my stitch marker there. On this one, it also, if you are newer to crochet, it helps you learn to identify what the rows look like, and that your beginning of round is not going to be straight up and down. So if you make a mistake and you're trying to pull out, your stitch marker falls out, know that as you pull out, that beginning of round shifts. It shifts over one stitch. All of your stitches will be going at an angle. Again, if you're right-handed, they're going to lean right. If you're left-handed, they're going to lean left. Okay. So I just found that helpful. It was nice not to have to move that stitch marker. Just a little extra tip there. Okay. So this is a good spot here to remind you how we do the invisible decrease. I like the invisible decrease because it quite honestly is just invisible. All right, so here was, I'm going to take this out. My stitch marker for my beginning round had been right here on this stitch, and I went one stitch beyond. So I'm going to go back because the beginning of round 10 for the leg starts with a decrease. There we go. And after you do that, those straightaways and you go all the way around several rounds, double check that you still have the same number of stitches. And I count them on the top. I count those little V's across the top. And just double check that you didn't skip one, you didn't add an extra. If you did, not a big deal. If you have too many, maybe add a little extra decrease here. If you're not enough, if you don't have enough, maybe don't do the decrease. If you're off by one stitch. If you're off by a lot of stitches, you probably need to rip it back because it's not going to match your other leg. If you're off by one, don't rip anything out. Just make a little adjustment. You're never going to see it. Okay, invisible decrease. You are going to go, you know what, I want to do it in the chunky monkey because it's a little bit bigger. Sorry about that. I think a little easier to see. All right, invisible decrease. So instead of going underneath both loops, like we normally do for a single crochet, to do an invisible decrease, you're only going to go underneath the front loop of the first stitch. We want to take two stitches and put them together. So there's the first stitch. And then you want to swing around and go underneath the front loop of the next stitch. Okay, so let me put my back through here. So I'll go through the front loop of the first stitch, the front loop of the next stitch, yarn over and just pull through those loops. And now it's like any other single crochet. Yarn over, pull through two. And what it does is it pulls those two stitches together without making a tight pucker or a hole of any kind. You really can't see it at all. And what a few people were saying last time is that their stitch count would be off after this row because they weren't sure where the next stitch was. So I just wanted to take a minute to show you. The two stitches that I pulled together really combine into this single crochet right here. So this one has been taken care of. So our next stitch is going to go all the way over here. So it looks like you're going kind of far, but you're really not because it pulls the front loop of those two stitches. It pulls it a little bit further this way. But once you go into your next stitch, it pulls it back up the way it should be. And then you can't see it. Okay, so just take a second, make sure you're maybe after the first time if you're not familiar with that. If you're not going to do the invisible decrease, this is the typical way to do a single crochet decrease. Go underneath both loops, pull up a loop, go into the next one, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through all three loops. It makes a little bit, it's totally fine to do it that way. I do find it makes a little bit more of a bulky decrease. It is also easier to see. So if you're wanting that, just so you can recognize stitches, totally fine. Okay. All right, so I covered invisible decrease, using your stitch marker to count. Okay, the other part I wanted to show you was, zoom out. This bunny's head is big. Okay, so here's my bunny head in the stone washed. And as I was doing it, I did not do it the first time. I had to go back and I had to count where my 16th row was. So I got smart on this one. This is the one I'm making out of Chunky Monkey. Hold it down a little bit here. So as I was doing the straightaway rows, when I finished them on row 18, so I finished like right here, I just counted back 2 rows. If I'm off a row, does it matter? Absolutely not. And I put a stitch marker there. So it's roughly going to be in the right place. So when I'm done here, I'm ready to put safety eyes in. And she has them 16 stitches apart. So you've got this, it looks like a bowl. You want to put the safety eyes in if you're using them before you stuff. So you could leave that one there. You could put them anywhere. There's no right or wrong side on this, but I'm just going to pretend that's where I want the first one. And then I'm just going to count 16 stitches over. It's right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, sticking in the same row. And I'll put a stitch marker there. So now I can get my safety eyes out. I'm not sure which size I want to use for this one. On the stone wash one, I used 10 millimeter, which I just kind of held them up and looked. I think I'll use bigger ones for this one. But now I know where my eyes are going to go. I can put them in. I know they're in the same row, and they're going to be roughly proportional to how she made the bunny when she designed the size and the shape of it. Okay. Let's see. So mark that on your pattern so you don't forget to do that part. Stuffing. She says in the pattern to stuff as you go. I felt like this opening, even on the stone wash, was plenty big. I didn't feel like I needed to stuff as I go. So I actually didn't stuff any of the pieces until I had completed them. Even, this is the leg. It is big enough to use, put the dowel in. You know, I like to use a pencil right now, a broken chopstick to stuff it with. And I like to break up my stuffing a little bit first. Even then, even on this one, which I feel like is one of the smallest ones, the arms and the legs as you finish, I had no problem getting the stuffing in and then pushing it down with either a dowel or a pencil and getting it down. So when you're stuffing, I'm going to start with the head and then I'll talk about the legs again. Break up your stuffing. And remember, it's always going to take more than you think. Leave a long tail when you finish each piece. I would say maybe like 12 inches or so, between 10 and 12 inches. We're going to use that for sewing up at the end. So then you don't have to have extra ends to weave in. So leave a long tail and don't accidentally stuff your tail. And you never want to put a giant wad in there. You will never get it the shape you want it to get. Always take little bits at a time. I like to pull it apart so the stuffing doesn't have any shape to it until I start to put it in. Okay. And once you get some in there, then you can start to push it to the sides. So the reason I'm doing this is that for next month, your homework is I want to spend time showing you how to attach and embellish your pieces next time. So if you could have your pieces done and stuffed, although if you have questions about stuffing, that's fine. I'm going to show you about the arms and the legs in a second here. But I start by pushing that out and starting to fill out because it kind of looks like a bowl. We want it to be more head shaped. pull it apart, stuff it in there. And this guy's going to take quite a bit. It's always going to take more than you think. But take the time to really pull it apart. I'm going to move to this other one here in a second. If you feel like you get a piece that's really compacted, take it out and break it apart again. You're only going to just be moving massive pieces around and you're going to get lumps. I would keep doing that until I got to something like this. And I really pushed it in the center out to really fill up that space. And then I just did a lot of this, like how squishy do I want it to be? There is plenty of room in here for me to pack more stuffing in, but I do want this guy to be fairly squishy, okay? Always remember though, that this stuffing will eventually compact down a little bit. So make it just a little bit firmer than you think it ought to be, particularly here at the top. We don't want a hollow piece here because this is actually his neck. This is the top of his head. This is his neck and his body. So we have big openings that we're going to be attaching together, which is nice because you won't get a floppy head. If you make a really narrow point, you're going to get a head that really flops. But we also don't want it to be a weak spot without any stuff in there. So once you get your shape pulled out and you've kind of left a hole in the center, we're going to put some more in there like that. Okay. So this piece, I feel like is a good shape. I've really mushed it a fair amount. Stuffing's coming out just a little. I'm totally fine with that because at least I know I'm going to be filled at my neck point when I seam it together. Okay. And then he's ready to go for next month. Do the same with the body. The ears, I'm going to save the ears for last. Fill them up, get them a good shape, fill them all the way up to the neck. Make sure he's roughly the same squishiness as the head. For the legs and the arms, they are both kind of light bulb shaped. I put a fair amount of stuffing down to the bottom. He's still got a nice squish factor to him, but he's a little bit bendable. Where you don't want to put a lot of stuffing is up here in the upper part, because then, particularly for his legs, they won't bend. They'll just kind of stick straight out. So I have a little bit of stuffing here. Because I don't want it to be totally flat, but the bulk of my stuffing is down here, and there's just a little bit right here, because I want it to be a little bit flexible when it attaches to the body. I want the arms or the legs to hang down a little bit. If it's too stiff, they're going to stick straight out. Okay. Stop shaking it and do it this way. So you don't want them just to stick straight out. You do want them to be a little bit flexible, so they'll hang down like that. The legs will hang down. Okay. So yeah, and like I said, I have a long tail ready to seam it up. The ears. So this particular pattern has you adding like a flannel or soft cotton something for the lining of the ears. Absolutely, you can do that. I'm going to demonstrate that on one of them, but I have some ideas for different things to do on that. I'll give you an alternative to next time. For the ears do not get stuffed at all. They are flat and floppy, so no stuffing in the ears. Unless you want to put a little bit in, that's fine, but it doesn't call for any stuffing. And you will get, or she didn't take it, I have an ribbon somewhere. You take the ear, Herschel? Nope, it's just down. So I actually cut my yarn a little soon on this one, so he has a little bit more to go. But they're going to be floppy ears. So I think the fabric is thick enough. I don't need to add any stuffing to that. If I do add any, it'll just be a very, very, very light layer and absolutely nothing at the top, so that they'll hang down and be floppy ears. So that's all I had for today. Does anybody have any questions?
One more one more question.
Yeah, Marlene, go ahead.
Do you, where do you get the stuffing and what kind of stuffing do you get?
So I get, I actually like the Polyfill brand, which Michael's no longer carries. They only carry their brand, and that
Mhm.
brand is just fine too. Either Joann's or Michael's carry it, or you can order it online. It doesn't cost very much. We have safety eyes at the shop if you want to use safety eyes in a variety of sizes. But I think I showed last time, they're actually in the other room. I bought a set of safety eyes from Amazon. It was a little box because I knew I was going to be playing with different one. I didn't want to use all of this the shop stock, but a wide variety of sizes and several of them in a little box for like $12. So no matter what I'm making, I've got safety eyes available.
So does the pattern say how much of the polyfill to buy?
Now you're going to get a small bag will do it because it's pretty compacted in there. You don't need a giant bag at all. Yeah, like this, I took some out of the bag. This will probably do the chunky monkey size bunny. This will probably be plenty. Like a gallon size bag full. Because once I pull it apart, and unless you want them extra firm, but one bag of stuffing will certainly do it, and you'll probably have enough for another one. It goes a fairly good way.
Thank you. It
You're
was
welcome.
really helpful.
Good. Well,
learned a
hopefully
ton.
I try to give a little tip that makes it a little easier. And I do work through all of the patterns ahead of time so that we're not stuck in the middle like, oh, well, this was a crap pattern. So I really like this pattern. I think it works up really well. She's very consistent with her increasing, and I think the proportions all work really well together. He's going to be really cute. So,
I'll say goodbye and thank you.
All right. Thanks, Marlene.
Bye.
Does anybody else have any questions? All right. I'm just going to stop the recording.